Rachel Carson was an influential American writer and marine biologist whose book Silent Spring helped initiate the environmentalist movement of the 1960s. LBJ was the 36th President of the United States who took over after JFK's assassination. He was a Democratic senator who had a good relationship with Congress to a point. He promoted Kennedy's agenda and was able to get most of what Kennedy had wanted through Congress, including the Great Society. He was elected then in 1964, had tax cuts, Civil Rights Act, and called for a war against poverty of all ages. Gideon v. Wainwright, Escobedo v. Illinois, and Miranda v. Arizona were all a series of Supreme Court cases that dealt with the rights of the accused. In Gideon, the Supreme Court case held that all persons charged with a felony must be provided legal counsel. In Escobedo, the Supreme Court found that the police must honor a person's request to have an attorney present during interrogation. So if you're called in for questioning and you say, I want to have my lawyer, they are not allowed to ask any more questions until the lawyer comes. In Miranda, the Supreme Court determined that an arrested person had the right to remain silent and that they had to be told what their rights were because not everybody knows that. So when you watch policing shows and you hear like you have the right to remain silent, anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law, those are called your Miranda rights, and those were created in 1965. The women's lib movement was basically a call for American women to abandon their traditional definitions of women's roles and increase opportunities for women in work. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of '64 said that women could not get jobs because they were women, and the National Organization of Women was founded to continue to push for women's equality. One of the head women for the women's lib movement was Betty Friedan, who was an author and an activist. She published a book called The Feminine Mystique in '63, and then she was one of the founders of NOW, which helped women's lib. The Civil Rights Act of '64 was a Kennedy brainchild, but he was killed before he could pass it. But basically, it strengthened voting rights protection, prohibited discrimination in places of public accommodations, required the federal government to withdraw support from any state that discriminated, and established the EEC to oversee hiring practices. Heart of Atlanta Motel v. U.S., a motel operator refused to serve an African-American customer. The Supreme Court upheld the Civil Rights Act of 64, basically saying this was like a test to see if the Civil Rights Act was constitutional. This Supreme Court case said, yes, the Civil Rights Act of '64 is constitutional. You cannot discriminate against people. So we were on the verge of some good stuff, and then Vietnam got even worse. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution, when our ship, the USS Maddox, was blown up in the Gulf of Tonkin, it was seen as an opportunity for Americans to go to war, but we didn't want to actually full-on declare war because that would seem too violent, and we didn't want to antagonize the Russians. So the Gulf of Tonkin resolution gave the president power to send troops in order to maintain American security, but now we revised it so that every so often, it's called the War Powers Act, the president has to go back to Congress and ask, hey, can I keep the troops there? Hey, can you keep funding them? Ralph Nader was an activist and advocate for consumers. His book, Unsafe at Any Speed, sped light on poor safety standards for automobiles. And then he later on would go and run as an environmentalist for the presidency in '96, 2000, and 2004. The Voting Rights Act of '65 was signed into law by LBJ, resulting as a result of demonstrations against measures used to prevent African Americans from voting, like poll taxes, violence, all those things. It basically said voters could no longer be forced to take literacy tax or pay these poll taxes. So it provided federal registration of African American voters in areas that up until then only 50% of eligible voters had registered. The Watts riots were 6-day riots in Watts, which is a little section of Los Angeles, caused by a drunk driving arrest of a young African American who was then apparently brutally beat by the police. And so it spurned this group of race riots, whereby 34 people died and over $200 million worth of property damage ensued. Other riots were spurred throughout the country. That's because you had civil rights leaders like Malcolm X who were promoting violence as a possible means to get their point across. They had said that nonviolence wasn't working, so it was time to use violence if needed. Now, Malcolm X personally, as a member of the Black Muslims, he went over and did this religious pilgrimage. He did the Hajj. When he came back as a changed person, saying, you know what, maybe there is some wisdom and enlightenment in these peaceful efforts, and he was gunned down by members of his own group as a response. The Black Panthers were founded by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale in California in '66. It was originally intended as a protectionary device of African Americans trying to protect from police brutality, but its goals changed over the years. It provided a variety of social programs within the African American community, including free lunches for children, and it also had political objectives, but it eventually split off in terms of how to best meet those objectives. Bobby Kennedy was JFK's brother and JFK's Attorney General. He then would go on to be senator, and as senator, as well as Attorney General, he was huge into civil rights, and also he was against the mob. He ran for president in '68, but was assassinated giving a presidential candidacy speech. Cesar Chavez was a migrant farm worker who founded the National Farm Workers Association. His goal was to defeat the persecution in the migrant worker system towards particularly Hispanic Americans, but also Asian Americans. He used strikes, pickets, and marches to help protect his workers. The counterculture movement began at Berkeley with the free speech movement. This is where the hippies would come out of. They were people who basically wanted to go against the mainstream, go against the war in Vietnam. They were pretty open with drug use and sex, and they were the ones who really pushed forward this thing called Woodstock, which was the culmination of the counterculture movement. Again, the whole time, Vietnam's still going on. The Tet Offensive is going to break out. This is the Lunar New Year. We called a ceasefire or a little truce, and the North Vietnamese violated it and launched a series of surprise attacks, which made us look really ridiculous. AIM, or the American Indian Movement, was an effort by Native Americans to kind of also join in the civil rights movement and try to get more rights for themselves, including getting some lands back that had been taken, as well as the enforcement of some treaties that they had agreed to. In 1969, some people think we landed on the moon. Richard Nixon was the 37th president, who he had also been a representative, senator, and vice president. He is going to push for Vietnamization, which is turning the Vietnam War over to the Vietnamese, and that's eventually going to get us out of the war. He opens trade with China, reduced tensions with the Soviet Union with the SALT treatment, resigned, though, because of Watergate. So really, up to a point, great president, kind of went a little crazy at the end there with Watergate, and it's a scandal. We still don't know his extent of his involvement, but he did help in détente, which is the thawing of the Cold War. The Pentagon Papers were basically a series of governmental reports that were leaked to the New York Times, or published in the New York Times, which detailed how we had fought the Vietnam War. And basically what it does is it creates a conflict over security versus liberty. Kent State, there were some students who were protesting the Vietnam War. The Ohio National Guard came in, killed 4 students, and it led to uprisings on other students and other colleges. The 26th Amendment was ratified in response to Vietnam, and I know you're like, whoa, we just repealed Prohibition with 21. What the heck's everything in between? We'll get there. It's another video. 26th Amendment basically said, hey, you know, we're sending 18-year-olds over to die in the war. Maybe they ought to have some say in that. So we granted the right to vote to 18-year-olds. Henry Kissinger was Nixon's security advisor and Secretary of State. He is going to be instrumental in terms of reaching the peace agreement with Vietnam, as well as playing a huge role in the SALT agreements. He also negotiates talks after the 6 Days War between the Arab countries and Israel. So these SALT treaties that I keep talking about, SALT stands for the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. Basically, it was a series of agreements between us and Russia, where we basically are trying to limit the use of weapons that we were scared of. And both of the treaties helped to reduce tensions between the US and USSR. All right, Watergate. Nixon wanted to run for re-election in '72, and he wanted to know what the Democrats were planning to do for their election so that he could run his election better. So he creates what's called the Committee for the Re-election of the President, poorly acronymed CREEP. And whether or not the president told them to, CREEP broke into Democratic headquarters, which were held in the Watergate Hotel complex, and then they were trying to steal the documents. These guys were caught, they were arrested. Nixon said he had nothing to do with it. One of the convicted burglars, however, said he did. There's a huge investigation that goes on, and we find a lot of wiretaps, presidential tapes, further evidence of espionage, and it kind of seems like, okay, he knew about something of it. It's also kind of weird because there's like tape recordings of White House conversations. These were asked to be turned over, and sections of time had been deleted. And so it's like, well, why did he delete it if he wasn't hiding something? It kind of all comes back to the cynical era that was brought forth by the Kennedy assassination. Two of the writers for the Washington Post, Robert Woodward and Carl Bernstein, were the ones who helped reveal a lot of the details through their covert meetings with a guy that we only found out recently who it was. But basically it seemed like there was deception at the highest political level, and it caused a lot of Americans to not trust the government, but Nixon ultimately resigns. In Furman v. Georgia, the Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty was unconstitutional unless fairly applied. Subsequent Supreme Court decisions have allowed the death penalty cases in certain circumstances. The War Powers Act, that was the thing that Congress used to get the president's power, get their power back from the president in terms of war. The president had to report to Congress within 48 hours of sending troops over and say why he sent them there. And then Congress has like a renewing card where every so often, in this case it's 90 days, the president has to go to Congress and say, can I keep troops over? Here's why I'm keeping them there. Here's what I'm doing. Here's the effort that's being made. And Congress passed this just to basically make sure that, checks and balances, they were keeping their war powers ability. Nixon had vetoed the act, but Congress passed the law anyways. The Saturday Night Massacre, when Nixon refused to give his tapes to the government special prosecutor, those ones I said that were deleted, Nixon ordered the Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Cox from the appointment. Instead of firing Cox, Richardson quit. Eventually the tapes surfaced, and when they were seen as having been deleted, that's when people got mad at Nixon. So no one actually died in the Saturday Night Massacre. You also have the emergence of what's called the New Right. Barry Goldwater was a U.S. Senator and Republican presidential nominee in '64, and he is the one who's kind of credited with like renewing what is conservatism and what does it mean to be a Republican. Ronald Reagan is going to then set the next bar in terms of like ideal Republicans. He was California governor, U.S. president. He was very conservative economically with what was called Reaganomics. But he was also very firm against the Soviet Union, which he called the evil empire. And a lot of people were like, oh, this is what it means to be a Republican, not Nixon. It was an effort to like distance from the ideals of Nixon. The moral majority movement was led by the evangelical Christians, including Jerry Falwell. They're going to focus on we as Republicans should get back to more conservative, traditional American values. So they were going to be the ones to promote the idea of, women shouldn't be equal to men and the races should be segregated somewhat. Eventually, when the argument of gay or straight comes out, they're going to be they're very big proponents of straight. So what we really associate today with conservative comes from the rise of this new right. Abortion is also going to be a hot topic during this time period, as well as religion.